Hello and welcome to our 25th anniversary stream celebrating Xwing Starfighters of Adumar, which was released on this day, August 3rd, 1999. I am Wedge, and I have with me my regular co-host, Wraith14.
I am the cartoon minister of crawling into very small spaces today, which means you can't see me, unfortunately. But
Oh man, I almost picked that as one of my quotes. I'm glad I didn't. And we have a special guest today, Meg from MegReviews.
Hello, thanks for having me here.
Thanks for joining us. I mean, we both just rewatched your Adamar review so that we wouldn't duplicate content. And it's clear that you join us in the many times rereading this beloved book.
Yes, I do. Oh man, there are like a certain number of books that if I am feeling down, I will pull these out, and Starfighters of Adumar is in that group.
Well, before we get too far into the whole retrospective and celebration, let's give a little context for any fans who might join us or watch this later who don't know much about Starfighters of Adumar. So, Starfighters of Adumar is the 9th book in the Xwing series of Star Wars Expanded Universe novels. As we mentioned, it was published August 3rd of 1999, written by Aaron Allston, who is the second author in the Xwing series after Michael A. Stackpole, who started it off with the Rogue Squadron series. Despite being the 9th book, it's very much in a television show from the late 90s model where character development and character threads are continued from the previous 8 novels, but it very much stands alone. It has its own beginning, middle, end. It does not end on a cliffhanger. It does not require you to have read the rest of the books, but having read the rest of the books, it very much enriches your appreciation for Wedge and the other characters of the story. So if you are intimidated by the fact that there are 10 books in the series, you can jump in and just read this one book to see if you like the flavor, and then read the rest if you do. The main story is pretty simple. The main action of the story takes place entirely on the planet of Adumar, which is a planet that's basically been exiled and isolated from the galaxy, and it's rediscovered about 12 years after the Battle of Yavin. I get confused because back when I read it, we were using the Battle of Endor, and I think it's about 9 years after the Battle of Endor.
Yes.
yeah, I think it's 1380 away.
Yeah. So technically, it takes place right during the main expanded universe novel Planet of Twilight, and there's a brief mention of that, but it's completely irrelevant, and in fact, I didn't know about it till about 2 years ago. Wedge Antilles, the main commander of Rogue Squadron throughout the X-Wing books and the rest of the Star Wars universe, basically, is commanded or manipulated by the head of New Republic Intelligence, General Kraken, into going on a diplomatic mission to try and secure missile manufacturing technology on this planet, because this planet is really industrialized, even though it doesn't have a really high level of galactic or interplanetary technology. So if Wedge can persuade the planet to join the New Republic, they get more missiles, which are very expensive. So it's been a requisitioning nightmare for Wedge and other starfighter commanders. Wedge agrees because only pilots have the kind of reputation in the Adumari society, which idolizes pilots, for a major figure from the New Republic to have some kind of cultural impact. But when he gets to Adumar, he finds himself locked in a miasma of backstabbing, betrayal, and honor duels. The entire society of the main nation of Kartan on Adumar is obsessed with honor duels, both in flying with their fighters, the blades, and with literal blades, which are called blast swords, which are basically about 1 to 2 foot long swords with a blaster on the tip. So if you hit someone with the point, you basically shoot them. And so he and his 3 most trusted and experienced lieutenants, Colonel Tycho Selchu, people will know him from the Rogue Squadron books, Major Wes Jansen, people will know him, of course, from Empire Strikes Back with Good Shot Jansen and the Wraith Squadron books. And Major Hobby Clivian, who people remember Hobby being mentioned in Empire Strikes Back. In the novelization, he died, but in the expanded universe, he didn't die. So he's back and making some hilarious jokes. The mission is complicated when they find out that the Empire has their 4 best pilots, all from the 181st Pilot Group, which is basically the Imperial version of Rogue Squadron that was developed first in the Xwing comics and later in the novels, led by Turfinier, and he's the only named pilot. And the Empire, of course, with their lack of respect for human life in general, joins in the honor culture and starts murdering peoples in duels all over the place and gain a lot of cultural power because of that. Wedge refuses to do so and finds himself in a professional dilemma. Should he obey New Republic intelligence, which seems to be telling him to murder people to get a diplomatic victory, or should he quit and lose his entire life? This is complicated by the fact that at the beginning of the book, he breaks up with his 2-year girlfriend, I want to say.
Yeah.
It's actually not that long if you think about it. Kui Zux, who was an Imperial scientist who helped design the Death Star, and then her memory got wiped, and so Wedge was her bodyguard, and they fell in love and hung out weirdly on the bridges of capital ships for 3 books. They break up at the beginning of this book, but that means that Wedge basically has no personal life. And he meets an old romantic interest, Yellow Wasiri, from both the Rogue Squadron comics and novels. And he discovers that there is a distance between them. And as the personal element of the mission with his relationship with Yella and the professional part of the mission with this tension between his desire to win the planet over and his refusal to murder people come into greater and greater conflict, he, because he's Wedge Antilles, does something unexpected and manages to get both missions accomplished to perfection. Anything you think I've missed out? Obviously, I didn't go deeply into the climax, but I think that it's very worth reading. So if you are interested by what I've said, you should definitely buy the book. I've put the link to the Amazon in this description. We are not sponsored. This is purely because we think you should read it.
And there will be spoilers later.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about the impact reading Starfighters of Adumar had on us personally. Wraith, when did you first read it, and what did you think and feel about it?
Well, this will be another familiar answer if you've been listening to other episodes, but I've read it so long ago, I don't remember it exactly. I was reading these right around like very early 2000s. So at least with Adumar, that wouldn't have been too much longer after it was published.
And what did you feel when you read it? I mean, as much as you can remember.
That's the tricky part. I mean, good story, very funny, and the pieces all come together at the end. It's just hard to really think what I actually thought at the time versus what am I just answering based on now.
Well, approximately how old would you say you were when you read it?
Maybe 10.
Okay,
11?
well, that makes sense because I was 13 when I first read it. So I have a much more vivid memory of both who I was and what I was doing then. Meg, what about you? When did you first read it, and what impact did it have on you?
I don't think I read it immediately when it came out, but I am pretty sure that I read it pretty close around there because that time in span, like 1999, Phantom Menace came out and the new Jedi Order series started, and I was like reading everything. I read Starfighters of Adumar and I laughed so hard the whole book. That is like my key memory of my first time reading it, is just laughing so much and enjoying it so much, and then finishing and being like, I sort of want to read it again. And then just like really loving the culture of Adumar, as ridiculous as it is, that Aaron Allston created, to the point that I don't really want to admit this, but in the early 2000s, I was writing a new Jedi Order fan fiction, and the main character was an Adumari running amok in the galaxy at large.
I mean, who among us has not written fan fiction that we may or may not be proud or embarrassed of?
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to own up to this one. I'm not sure I could even find it because it was posted on a message board, but I remember enjoying the process.
I was about 13 when I read this. I got it from the library. I didn't have a job, didn't have a really big allowance, and I didn't really buy a lot of books in my childhood and teens, except from library sales. So I borrowed it from the library, probably a month or two after it came out. And I remember reading it, and then I think I read it again before I had to return it. So it was a couple weeks that I had it, and I read it about twice, and I was just so invested. The combination of the romance and the brotherhood of the four main pilots, and the action. It's one of
Yeah.
the most action packed of the Xwing books, I would say, both in hand to hand combat and all the, of course, Xwing space and air piloting. And I just think that it's so brilliantly constructed and executed. The humor is a huge part of it. I still laugh out loud when I'm reading it or listening to it, and I think that the characterization of the pilots has never been stronger. Partly because, unlike all the other books, he only has 4 real pilots to have to deal with. Because all the
Yeah.
other books, you've got somewhere between 8 and 12 pilots, and Alston does a great job of trying to give everyone an arc and personality and even a voice. But when you have 4, you can really focus in on motivations and relationships and drives.
Yeah.
And it's for all from one person's point of view,
Yes.
Yeah.
which is rare in Star Wars.
Yeah, that's actually my third point. So let's jump to my third point. We'll go back to my second point. I think that the first point of view has a ton of strengths, but also maybe some drawbacks. What do you think if Alston had chosen to, as he usually does, go between about 5 different points of view, and maybe had a Tycho point of view, or and a Yellow point of view, or a Tomer point of view?
Well, I think what's going on with Tomer would have been ruined if we ever got in his head, because it's like Wedge is like, this guy's supposed to be helping us, but he's pushing us to do actions that I'm not comfortable with. And I'm, for what, I'm glad that we didn't get Tomer's point of view, because he's trash.
I mean, spoilers, he is the villain, and he's a particularly despicable villain.
He
Yeah.
reminds me of somebody from a book Wedge and I have been just now finished another series. Which you'll know exactly who I'm
series by
talking
Brandon
about.
Sanderson.
Ooh, okay.
But yeah, I think it definitely was better suited being one person's point of view, because this is really Wedge's story, and he has to comes to terms with things as part of. Really, it's, and this surprised me on the reread, just about the middle of the book.
Yeah.
But it would have been interesting if there'd been a side story from Ayala's point of view.
Well, we've been joking about it on the Discord server and also in our show notes. Wraith has an interesting title for what we should call Ayala's parallel novel. I wanted to call it Undercover in Adumar.
So since she's originally there as a undercover identity of Code Slicer, I was saying, well, Slicers of Adumar has the same ring to it.
I would read that.
I said we should go full Kevin J. Anderson Dune fanfiction and call it The Lady Slicer of Adumar.
And the thing is, like, Adumari culture, they probably straight up would have called her that too. They'd been like, "Oh, we have hired a lady slicer," and you're like, "She's a slicer."
Oh, Adumari culture.
Yeah, I love them. They're a mess.
They are. They gave me a real visceral hatred of honor culture for 20 years, and I've just now been unpicking that. And I still don't like it on an emotional level, but I think it's more complicated. I don't think that Alston intends to say that honor, of course, is wrong. I think that his philosophical goal, of course, is to unpick what happens when honor becomes the only virtue and is purely externally enforced.
Yeah, like I think a problem with Adumar is they're rabid about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that is the only way of like achieving a high status of people respecting you. It's why Cheris becomes the good, sword fighter, blade sword fighter that she is, because she can't fly and she doesn't see any other way of getting respect from the people around her. And it's like, I agree that Alston's saying honor's a good thing to be concerned with, but these people have taken it way too far, and this is to a toxic degree.
And with Cheris, it's not just respect. It's she had to work in a factory for a year to
Yeah.
support herself until she could just make money doing duels to the death. And her mother previously worked in that factory and died of, I think it's called brown lung,
Yeah.
from working there. So
I am really curious what Alston's socioeconomic background was, because he talks about growing up in as a child of divorce, so mother, father splitting his time, but he doesn't talk a ton about the jobs that his family had. And this book makes me think that either his direct family or close cousins worked in factories, because brown lung is clearly a reference to things like black lung that miners would get. And the factory conditions are very, satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution evocative.
Yeah.
they also have the place where everybody who works in the factory lives above the factory, so that if there's a bombing, in like aerial bombing in a war, the workers get killed before the factory is destroyed.
Yeah.
Literal human shields.
Oh god.
And so yeah, Wedge hears about this, and that's how we find out Cheris' backstory. And Wedge is like,
well, we've mentioned Cheris. We've mentioned Cheris a few times. Wraith, why don't you give us some context for Cheris? Because I kind of left her out of my summary.
So she's their appointed guide through kind of going around Cartan, shaking hands, telling stories, and is also like the best sword fighter around. But since she's not a pilot, she doesn't have much respect, and there's a lot of pilots who try to duel her with swords to prove they're better. Like we first see that with Wedge not knowing what her competition is going to be, and just saying, "Yeah, do that. I need a distraction so I can make contact with Ayala." Then he finds out what's going on, and Tomer's like, "Well, I thought you knew," but
Tomer knew full well he didn't know, though.
And
a key point, though, about Cheris is that she's, I think, 16 in the book.
She's very young, yeah.
I was going to say, Wedge manages to get out of having to do a gladiator style, like thumbs up, thumbs down, by saying, well, this young man needs to learn how to handle pain. So don't kill him. Otherwise, he'll embarrass his family.
Which is an extremely Wedge solution to difficult problems.
Yeah.
But Cheris, despite the kind of gap between their ages, develops an infatuation with Wedge that, of course, gets complicated when he's leaving to go meet with Ayala.
Well, and let's clarify that Wedge is 100% professional, never takes advantage, never even thinks about doing anything romantically with Jarrus.
So is that enough of a description on her?
So let's jump back a little bit. What impact would you say Starfighters of Adumar had on the Star Wars Expanded Universe?
Not a whole lot on its own. So part of the detail with Wedge and Ayala is there was a very brief line in one of Zahn's Hand of Thrawn duology novels. I forget which.
Is Vision of the Future on
Where
Batuu.
it establishes the two of them are together, and Starfighters of Adumar was just going back and explaining how that came to be, because at the time, the most recently published novel that touched on it, which I had not read, had Wedge with Zux. And I guess Zahn was just like, no. And then, since we didn't talk about it, the opening of Starfighters of Adumar is a hilariously fast mutual breakup between Wedge and Kui, where the opening line is about how Wedge is going to have to end the relationship with Kui, but before he can, she ends it with him.
Yeah.
And that opens the door for Ayala, though Ayala is stubborn, to say the least. But yeah, we don't really see ramifications of the New Republic having a whole bunch more proton torpedoes that I knew of, so it's...
I mean, you could argue that the New Republic relies heavily on proton torpedoes in the New Jedi Order, and Adumar is part of how they're able to do that.
Right. Well, it's not directly stated that I remember, although I believe in the first Legacy of the Force novel by Allston, some characters do go to Adumar.
Yep.
Yeah, it's sort of as the book opens, Adumar is one of the planets that's not happy with the Galactic Alliance. So we see Luke dispatches Jason and Ben there to deal with some sort of problems. And then, of course, the series gets distracted, and Corellia is the one key upset planet, and we never see Adumar again. But I guess it makes sense that they would be the kind that's hey, we want to do our own thing.
Well, I mean, they're still a pretty new and culturally very divorced segment of the population, and I could definitely see a fair amount of resentment that the New Republic basically just allied with them for proton torpedo manufacturing.
Yeah.
Jarrus does have a couple minor appearances in books way down the road too, and that business with Crimson Empire 3 doesn't count. Where there's a brief scene with someone trying to stir up a riot in ways that make no sense in terms of the ending of this book. So we'll skip past that.
Crimson Empire and Making Sense have never been a combination that has ever been particularly close.
No.
Meg, other than that opening of betrayal in Legacy of the Force, what impact would you say Starfighters of Adumar had on the expanded universe?
I think, besides what Wraith talked about, not just explaining why Wedge and Ayala are together again, but showing it, it's, to me, felt like a conclusion to the Bantam era, that if Vision of the Future is the most forward chronologically Bantam era book, but I think that Starfighters of Adumar was one of the last Bantam books to be published, it just felt to me like wrapping up that era in the way that this is a very small conflict, but it's character focused. And I think the expanded universe going forward was focused a lot more on like big things, like galaxy wide things. And there were like character moments, but it was much rarer going forward for there to be like a whole book just focused on Wedge. Because it just seemed like scopes got, from the New Jedi Order going forward, got very big. And I think that's part of why I like Starfighters of Adumar, because it is so self-contained.
Yeah. Although I'd also argue that paradoxically, the cast of characters kept shrinking so that it felt like the entire galaxy revolved around just this one family's internal disputes.
Yeah.
Which Allston always tried to get away from that by having Wedge be a point of view and adding extra characters, but unfortunately his co-authors tended to laser back in. And I think there was some editorial demand to focus on those original movie characters.
Yeah.
And their children.
Yeah, I think if you look at the Bantam era of books as like a TV show, the Hand of Thrawn is the season finale. It wraps up all the main plot lines, gives sort of a happy ending to our main characters, and pushes us forward into the future. And Starfighters of Adumar is like that one episode that's kind of an epilogue. It's looking back, settling some things, tying up a few smaller plot lines that hardcore fans care about, but is not really essential for the lore.
Yeah.
But I think it's also a book that just stands out in people's memories because you can hold it in your head and your heart so completely in a way that even a book like a trilogy, there's so much in a trilogy that you can forget pieces and little threads spin out of your control.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to agree that unfortunately or fortunately, Adumar doesn't have the kind of splash that, say, the Rogue Squadron books do, because you capture Coruscant, or the Wraith Squadron books, even though those have less of an impact because Zinj is actually killed in a different book.
Yeah.
But Adumar is just about Wedge, and you do see that every time Allston writes Wedge, because the setup of his relationship and his voice and the setup of Iela's relationship and her voice are very consistent when you read Enemy Lines in New Jedi Order and the 3 Legacy of the Force books where Iela shows up, I would say, as a major supporting character, and Wedge is a major character. And that characterization is not something that I would argue is present before that, because understandably, because of the Kwisatz relationship, Stackpole couldn't write Iela as a main love interest. Like he hints at it, but he's never able to write them together or even getting together. So Allston setting that up and giving it a flavor and an emotion, and then being able to write it again in the future, I think does have an impact, at least for those of us who think that Wedge matters.
Yeah.
It is heavily implied in Solo Command, the start, that they go on a date.
Yes, and there's also hints that they are sort of dating in Isard's Revenge. But then, of course, in iJedi, because he's setting up for the Jedi Academy trilogy and Quee's entrance, they can't really be in it, because you don't want Wedge to look like a cheater who's going out with Yellow at one point and then immediately goes out with Quee.
Yeah.
So,
especially given Iola's story, which, if you've read Starfighters, well, it's explained, but yeah, her husband had been captured by the Empire, brainwashed at Lusancia, and when he was activated, she had to kill him herself. So very dark.
Yeah.
Well, the funny thing about that is Stackpole originally wanted Wedge to just get with Iela, but then he found out that Kevin J. Anderson was creating Kwisatz, because these novels were all basically commissioned at the same time. And so they were at a convention, and Kevin J. Anderson, I've created Wedge until his love of his life. It's a bird. Stack was like, crap, now I have to give his love interest a terrible, tragic event so we can't get together with her.
Yeah, it always felt to me like I could sense the connection between Wedge and Ayala, even when they first meet. But, she is married. She loves her husband. And then her husband is brainwashed and she has to kill him. And so, you can see where, especially I feel in the little tiny bits we see of her in the Wraith Squadron books, where like Wedge likes her a lot, but Wedge is like, I'm gonna take this slow. And then we get to iJedi, which, to explain the Jedi Academy trilogy, seems to be offering the explanation that Wedge is going through some sort of midlife crisis.
Ah, yes, that 32-year-old midlife crisis.
I mean, Kui is a pretty lady.
Bird.
She's a bird.
But the breakup scene is well done and mature on both their parts.
Yeah. I was not a fan of Kui's character, but I felt like Aaron Allston handled her in a very respectful way in the beginning of Starfighters of Adumar. I feel like I was one of those people that's like, yeah, they need to break up because, but then you're like, well, but she's a person. You don't want to be mean about it. And I think the way that he wrote it comes across so well. Not just that, like, Wedge is like, I'm going to have to break up with her. I'm going to have to break her heart. And then she does it first and shows a lot more insight than Wedge even has.
I probably read the Jedi Academy trilogy books, but I didn't reread them, and I have no real memory of it. So for me, Kwisatz is just that first chapter.
I mean, I'd read iJedi, but that's all I really knew of Kwisatz. I still actually haven't read the Jedi Academy trilogy.
Oh, it's
something.
I've
read Darksaber.
Yeah, it introduces a lot of things that are important,
Yes.
and I know some people love Kevin J. Anderson's writing and find it very cinematic, but I find it very it feels more like young adult or juvenile fiction than an adult novel to me.
I agree completely. I think that I think it's mostly because the way Kevin J. Anderson tends to write characters, they react and they act from very first layer motivations. Everyone, there's a skin, and just below the skin there's the motivation, and that's it. But Alston, because he's going, and this is true even when Wedge isn't the only point of view characters, I'd say that all the Wraith characters have at least 3 layers of motivation that he digs into for each of the novels. And that, I think, and I would argue that some of the better writers like Timothy Zahn and Matthew Stover also really develop deep layers of motivation, whereas some of the other writers, particularly in my opinion, Kevin J. Anderson and Troy Denning, tend to write very one-layer motivations. And I want to contrast, and I don't know if Wraith has read this, actually. We haven't talked about this. Tempest by Troy Denning in the Legacy of Force series, where you have the breakup of Zek and Jaina, and the opening chapter of Starfighters of Adumar, because Zek and Jaina are pure reaction, single layer, a lot of just unconscious stupidity, and it culminates in this scene that seems right out of mid-2000s Reddit. Actually, I don't know if Reddit existed, but it seems very Reddit to me. Whereas Kui and Wedge's breakup is a scene that is written deliberately to highlight both characters' maturity. Both characters are not interested in hurting others, but both characters also know that it would ultimately hurt both of them if they stay together because it's wasting their time. And it sets up a major theme of Wedge's personal arc, which is the future. personal lives. And I would say this ties back to Xwing Iron Fist, where Runt hosts the ball, and he tells Wedge that in warfare, everything's about the now and the past, remembering who's died and trying not to die yourself. But mates are the future. And this book is about Wedge's finding his mate and his future.
Yeah.
And we know that from Wedge and Yella come two daughters who become major figures in the next generation of galactic leaders and starfighters and intelligence. So I love the fact that this first scene isn't just mechanical. It's not just we have to get Wedge broken up so he can get together with the actual character. It also is pure thematic setup and payoff. And I think that's just so characteristic of Allston's brilliance as a writer. And I really do think he was brilliant as a writer.
And Quee tells him, you didn't intend it, but for you, this has been like a simulator run to prepare you for the next relationship, the one that'll matter. So she's
I need to
pretty
add
much
something else to my
setting that up.
retcons.
I love it.
So let's talk a bit about that romance, because we all have different takes on romance, I would say, from the various reviews I've listened to from Meg and Wraith and I's conversation about his fan fiction writing. He's developed a very deep parallel from the perspective of A-Wing pilot Dorset Kinnair, who is introduced in the Wraith Squadron books. And so he's really gone a different route, and we've talked about why he's chosen to focus on or not focus on different kinds of romance. So
there's really not much romance to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I'm talking about.
So what do we all think? Meg, why don't you start us out on your analysis of Wedge and Yella's romance in this book? What you like about it, what you don't like, and where you think it could go.
What I like so much about Wedge and Yella in this book is I think what I like so much about the beginning chapter, which is how adult they feel, that this isn't like people just blindly following their hormones, that like, there's a definite connection between them, but there's also like really rational reasoning behind it. And it's like Wedge sees Ayala, who he presumably has not seen in a while, and she's obviously undercover, and he wants to talk to her, and she doesn't want to engage with him really at all. And I feel like once you dig into it further, you see how Wedge's, I guess, not knowing what he wants out of life and just sort of bouncing around in the previous books, how that's really hurt her. But in turn, like, seeing her reaction to him is very hurtful to Wedge. But then they're able to talk it through. I just love that. I also love that poor Jansen is like left out in the hallway the whole time.
Like literally the entire night.
Yeah, he's there for hours
when it comes out.
And I guess that's what I love so much about it, is that I felt like the scenes with Wedge and Ayala are very romantic, but I find them so romantic because they just feel like real adult people. Like, not one-dimensional characters. Like, he has very much fleshed them out here.
I mean, they're like, let's get together, and now let's get married.
Yeah.
And it works.
It works. It's like in Vision of the Future, which is somewhat tackling a similar task, where we've got Luke Skywalker and Mara Jade, and Timothy Zahn wants to get them together. And my feeling on that book was that they had a lot of really good conversations about how Luke perceives the Force and how Mara perceives the Force, and how they, what she thinks of what he has done in the past 10 years. But then the scene where he's like, let's get married, and she's like, yes, sort of took me by surprise, because I felt like their conversations were about reestablishing their friendship, and then they jumped right to marriage. And I don't have that problem with Wedge and Ayala because I feel like I can see that they're ready. And maybe because we already saw them in the Rogue Squadron books and the Wraith Squadron books, but I didn't have the same issue that I had with Luke and Mara in Vision of the Future that I have with Wedge and I don't have that issue with Wedge and Ayala. I love them in this book.
And there's kind of a shared element of they're saying this, but they don't know if they're both going to survive what's to come.
Yeah.
Especially in Wedge's case.
Wedge goes
But
up
he does.
against some absolutely ludicrous odds in this book.
Yes.
We have a comment from the audience. Admiral Byzantium, who's a longtime poster on our shared Discord server. That's one thing I like about the way Stackpole and Allston write their characters. Their characters are consistently very adult. The characters feel like professionals. And I think that's really true. I think that one of the things that sets apart Kevin J. Anderson and Troy Denning's writing of characters, especially characters like Wedge, is that those characters tend to be, they exist only to support the main characters. Whereas Allston and Stackpole, especially Allston, because Allston tends to imbue even a minor character, like a character whose speeder gets stolen at the beginning of a heist, with an entire backstory of he's lived this way, he's got an ex-wife, but he's got a daughter, and he's going to give his business to her, and then all of a sudden his speeder is stolen by the main characters. But you have such a memory, like, I remember that character. And I think that speaks to the level of detail and additional layers of motivation and habit and experience that Allston and Stackpole really give their characters. Now, at one point, at some point in the future, I do want to see if I can get together a Vision of the Future stream. Maybe I can convince Byzantium to join us for that one. But because I actually think that the romance in Vision of the Future is intensely romantic, but it's entirely nonverbal, which is a different experience.
Yeah.
The Allston is an extremely articulate person. Like, if you ever listen to any of his interviews, you can really see where both the humor and the wit and the quick thinking, just ability to talk his way around problems and ideas comes from. And I think one of the most interesting thing is Wedge is actually not the most articulate person. He's an introvert, and he often does things that he doesn't truly understand. One of the things that's so great about this novel is Wedge will often, he has a strong belief and a strong feeling that he should or shouldn't do something, but he can't figure out why. And Hobby has this great quote about how, do what you always do to us. Tell us you're doing something, but don't tell us why, and then make us talk about it until you figure out one of the things we say that you like, and then say, that's what I meant all the time. And Wedge actually does this 3 times throughout the book.
He also has a rehearsed 4-part speech that he can deliver at a moment's notice. And does so at least twice in this book.
Yeah. One of the most fascinating things about growing as a reader for me is that I've started to be able to see more of authors' personality in the way they structure their characters. So Allston and Timothy Zahn are both very introverted people, and their characters tend to be introverted. Even when they write a more social character, there's a sense of isolation and loneliness and not fitting in that I think is probably part of why those characters and those characterizations tend to speak to an audience. I mean, I myself am very introverted, and I love the characters of Wedge and how Zahn writes Luke and Mara, who are very introverted as well. And so that, I think, very much speaks to a lot of people who might read books as kids who aren't as into the sports and social activity because we don't get it.
Yeah.
So here I wanted to transition into speaking a little bit more specifically about each of the characters in the book and what we loved, like favorite parts of their part in the book. So let's start, of course, with our main character, Wedge Antilles. Wraith, what is your favorite part of what Wedge does in this book?
I'm glad you asked me first because there's a good chance we're all going to say the same thing.
I'm
So I
curious.
will
This is gonna be
claim
fun.
his kind of the moral question he has about, if I do this and go ahead with these honor duels, that I'm easily going to win, and I'm just killing these pilots willy-nilly, and that's what's needed to bring Adumar into the New Republic. What does that mean for me? Will the New Republic change Adumar, or will Adumar change the New Republic for the worse? And all this is coming out right around when he's thinking about Aiella and the questions about his future, because he's telling these Adumari pilots that, honor isn't like an external thing, it's about the regard that other people have for you. And thinking at the same time, Aiella kind of doesn't want anything to do with me anymore and said we're not friends now, and I don't know how that happened. So all that's going around in his head, and he manages to answer all those questions collectively.
Meg, what about you? What is your favorite Wedge thing in this book?
I think my favorite Wedge thing, I do love that when he's looking at, especially the situation, and he's being pushed by Tomer Darpin to do things that he absolutely does not agree with. And he's like, do we even want Adumar here? I think my favorite thing with Wedge is the way that he comes to a conclusion about the situation, and especially when the parroter of Cartan is like, oh, well, you will side with us, you will fight with us, and the Imperials are like, yeah, and Wedge is like, no thank you. and everyone is like shocked, and Wedge is like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, oh. It's almost like he's obviously about to walk into great danger thanks to Tomer Darpin, but he feels like so much better, like articulating, like no. That's my favorite Wedge of the whole book. Just Wedge finally making his mind up and then being like, oh my gosh, that felt good.
My choice is actually very different than both of these. I grew up not really getting how to figure out a lot of life. And Wedge being frustrated in having to do things that he didn't want to do, specifically command fleets and make logistical decisions, when what he really wanted to do was fly, really speaks to me. Like the ability of being born to do something. I mean, I just rewatched Chariots of Fire, and Eric Little, he says, when I run, I feel God's pleasure. And there's that sense that when Wedge flies, he's just alive in a way that he's not anywhere else. And that pure passion and skill and joy in flying is something that I just found so cool. And it reminds me of one of my other favorite characters who I didn't discover until about 5 or 6 years later in college, which is Samuel Vimes from the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. And for those who don't know, Samuel Vimes he starts out as the sergeant of a small command of watchmen in a semi-medieval fantasy city in this world called Discworld, which is a flat earth on the back of 4 elephants on the back of a turtle. So it's very parodic. And I feel like if you like Aaron Allston's goofy, hilarious, madcap sense of humor, you would definitely get along with Terry Pratchett's sense of humor. But also, Sam Vimes is just this incredibly driven cop with a sense of justice and integrity, and also the fallibility of man and his own dark nature. And that conflict and his desire to be on the front lines when he keeps getting promoted higher and higher, from sergeant to captain, from captain to commander, from commander to duke of the whole city. Whereas Wedge goes from, captain to commander to general to fleet general. And he's just like, but I would like to just fly by Xwing. So that similarity really always struck home to me, and I've loved both of those characters for a really long time. And I do highly recommend the Discworld Watch series, starting with Guards, Men at Arms, a couple other in the middle, and then I argue that the Watch finale should be Thud, even though Snuff is technically a further book, but Snuff was not good.
Mm.
All right, let's go to our next main character. I'm going to argue, let's go to Iella. So what's a favorite Iella moment or piece of this book?
Who goes first?
Let's go in the same order. So Wraith.
Okay. Well, I'd very much like to know how, but the fact that she just, after Wedge had requested it and said, this is basically impossible, but I'm going to ask anyway, and then she just hands him Robert's comp frequency, and you never find out how.
Meg, what about you? What's your favorite Iella piece?
Ooh. I think my favorite is how quickly she goes from like, Wedge, I really want to help you, but I have to do my job. And then Hallis shows her the footage, and then she's immediately like, okay, Wedge, I'm helping you. I just love she's like, I have a superior, I got things. And then it's like, no, he's terrible. I am helping you.
I think for me, my favorite Iella piece would be when she tells the tech to paint Wedge's helmet with the same little wedges of gold in the second to final battle in Cortan.
Yeah.
There's just a sense of her complete attention to detail and her knowing things. And I do really kind of want the Lady Slicer of Adumar as the novel now. Let's go through the pilots now, starting with Tycho. Wraith, what's a favorite Tycho moment?
So there's a bit where they've managed to get out of Cartan and gotten to a nation that's friendly to them. And Wedge starts to make battle plans and tell the other pilots, so Tycho, Wes, and Hobby, what they're going to do. And Tycho's just like, no. And orders Wedge, his superior, to sleep so that Tycho can't, because he says, you're exhausted, you stay up all night making plans, and some 20-year-old is going to shoot you down easily and brag about it for the rest of his life, and he doesn't deserve to get to do that. So you sleep. I'm going to make the mission because I know how to do that. I've been leading Rogue Squadron for the past however many years.
I think it must be at least 3 years at this point.
Plus when Wedge was with the Wraiths. So
yeah, that was only 3 months.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then Wedge, 11 hours later, is when he wakes up and is shaving and getting dressed for the day, and off they go.
Meg, what's your favorite Tycho piece?
I think my favorite Tycho piece is the Adumari have nicknames for all the 4 pilots, and that I think Tycho's is the dour one.
I think it's the doleful one.
The doleful one. And you'd think that's bad, but they all love him. He's like... And like... Jansen is telling them this, that they all have these nicknames, and Wedge is like, what? And Tycho's just like, okay. The way he just deals with that. And then even, too, the way that Wedge is like, hey, Tycho's the only one of us who's in a happy relationship. And Tycho's just like, yeah. He's just the best second in command.
I really love that. Just the way Tycho... Like, it's funny. Everyone has these great one-liners, and when I was a kid, I just was laughing at just how great the banter and the back and forth was. But rereading it as an adult, I'm just amazed at how Tycho consistently is always thinking of being second in command, thinking of logistics, thinking of supporting Wedge. And Wedge, of course, is always thinking of the big picture. He's the leader. Yeah. And Hobby and Wes, Hobby's always, of course, more biting, more sarcastic, and Wes is more just off the wall goofy. And so each of them has a place in the structure, and I love how well Allston sets up Tycho. So he's not like a wet blanket. Like you could
No.
so easily write the second in command as the wet blanket, but he's got so many zingers of his own that he's not.
Like so many times when Wes is just out of control, it's Tycho who just like pops his bubble and ends it.
Yeah. So I mean, Meg kind of stole what I was doing. I love the doleful one and the fact that Tycho's like, I'm not sad. But I think I will go with Tycho. This might be a bit of a sort of deep cut, but in the second arc of the Rogue Squadron comics, Tycho gets in a really bad fist fight with about 4 Empire supporters. And he actually beats up 3 of them really badly, and it's only when one of them sneaks behind him and hits him with a stick that he starts to lose. And so Tycho being highlighted in the first assassination attempt as being really good with his fist and really agile and on his feet, I really liked as a callback to that, because I love that Phantom Affair arc of the comics. So let's move, of course, to everyone's favorite crazy child, Wes Jansen. Wraith, I know it's hard to pick because he's got so many, but pick a favorite Wes piece.
So there's a bit where, like we mentioned, Cheris has been taking duel after duel because she realizes Wedge and Ayala are together. And so she loses and at the Parator's command, no, not at the Parator's command, she spurned the Parator at the command of the guy who defeated her girlfriend. She's about to die. And Wedge is about to jump in and try to blast sword fight to save her life. But Jansen does it first and tells him, for several reasons, I'm the one doing this, not you. You know, you do it out of duty. I'm going to enjoy this. You're not expendable as much as I am. And I know you are probably now engaged, so consider this the first present. And then basically, instead of dueling the guy with the swords like usual, he just locks the sword up with one hand and starts punching the guy. Because like Tycho, he's also good with his fists.
Meg, what's your favorite or a favorite Wes piece?
I think I love how much Wes gets into the Adumari fashion. And finally, Wedge reins them in, and it's like, no, we are wearing our uniforms, because Wes just loves it to the extent that by the end of the book, when they're having a party and it's the end, and he still has an Adumari cape, and it's a cape with view screens that are displaying like kick lining Jansen's.
Wes doing the can.
Yeah, I just love the way, like, his humor, but his humor specifically in regards to clothing. I love Wes. He's delightful.
Everyone, I feel like if you don't love Wes, there's something probably wrong with you. And I love the fact that Allston knew that everyone loved Wes and never let that take over a book. Like, this is the closest Wes comes to being like a main character, but he's still restrained and he still has those serious moments. And I think my favorite Wes piece is when he almost manages to beat Wedge in their first simulated combat because he's an experienced rear gunner.
Yeah.
So I love that kind of callback, of course, to Good Shot Jansen in Empire Strikes Back. Last of our quartet of pilots, we have Hobby. Now, Wraith, you've already mentioned what I think is your piece, but go ahead.
For Hobby, I put down that he didn't have as much to do, but I like the bit where I don't think we've talked about it here. There's basically a point where it's just like, I've had it. I want lethal efficiency.
Yes.
Yep. What about you, Meg? What's a favorite hobby piece?
My favorite hobby moment, besides the I'm done, when he's just completely done. He's like, I don't like this place. I'm done. Is when Wedge says, I have an idea, and Hobby says, does that include us putting on women's clothing? After he's explained the idea, to putting on women's clothing, and Wedge is like, no. And then we cut to the next chapter, and they're sitting in a vehicle and they're all wearing women's clothing, and Hobby's just like, you lied to me, and Wedge is like, yes. with my it's something with my increasing diplomatic or authority or something, I've learned that like lies motivate people, something like that. But just the way that he lists the whole thing, I think the way Allston sets up the joke and be like, of course not, and then it immediately opens and just Hobby's, you lied to me. Yes.
As Admiral Byzantium says, Hobby has too many good moments.
He does.
And my personal favorite Hobby moment is when he's flying against Tycho in the first simulated combat. He is able to analyze why Tycho struggles with the blades, because Tycho loves A-Wings and TIE fighters.
Yeah.
He loves being able to move. And if you read iJedi, you really understand that, because he's constantly thinking about where he can move and how he can move. And he just has this amazing instinct of how to tumble through evasive maneuvers. And if you're in a flying rock like a Blade 32 or a Y-Wing, that's just hard to do.
Yeah.
All right, so that's our main heroes. Let's move to our villains, and let's build to our main villain by starting with a minor antagonist, who of course has a change. And I'm going to highlight. I didn't forget. Where is it? Here it is. I didn't forget this. I just wanted to get to it in time. So let's talk about Admiral Rogris. Terran Rogris from Solo Command makes a bigger appearance here in Starfighters of Adumar. Oh, Wraith.
Yeah,
What's his favorite Rogris moment?
Oh, I didn't realize we were including him, and I'd written some of these down.
Failure.
Now
I'll go.
Then I go first.
Go for it, Meg.
I think what I appreciate about Rogris's character here is how he seems to be going through a similar moral dilemma that Wedge is, but he takes a different approach to it, the not perhaps best approach to it. That Wedge is like, how can I don't agree with what these people are doing and what I'm being pushed to do. And like Rogris has obviously been told that like the Empire must have Adumar, and if they don't get to Adumar, they're going to do the Imperial thing. And he doesn't like that because he's previously shown himself to be a very reasonable Imperial, an Imperial who will work with the New Republic for a common goal. And so I think seeing him just drinking his sorrows away enforced to me how much he's going through the same thing as Wedge, but how Wedge is handling it better.
Yeah. I mean, you see Rogris about 3 times, and 2 of those times he's really, really drunk.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the first time, Wedge has stumbled into Rogris at the bar, where he was also trying to consider his situation. And Wedge just flat out tells Rogris, you do the Empire a big favor by shooting me. And Rogris is like, well, I'd never do that, not even for the bounty on your head. I want to see how you try to get out of this mess, too.
Even the bad guys have hilarious wit.
Yep.
I would say my favorite Rogris moment is actually not when he's in, but when you see Wedge talking with Captain Salaban about Rogris's reputation in the fleet, where they say he's a wily old so-and-ho, likes tactics for its own sake, doesn't like slugging it out, and doesn't like super weapons that cause atrocities. So I appreciate there's a lot of depth in the antagonist in this book. Perhaps not as much in a character like Turfanier, which is interesting. Tur is basically kind of a cipher throughout the book. But Rogris and the Adumari villains, and of course the villain we're about to get to, are all very layered, I would say.
Yeah.
So let's move to that main villain, Tomer Darpin. Wraith, what's a favorite piece of Tomer Darpin?
Well, when it's revealed just how much he's kind of been playing everyone along, including the Parator, where, he tells Wedge, I'm going to try to figure this out. And then goes to the Parator and says, Wedge would like to help you, but he's under diplomatic orders and he can't. And the only way he can get out of it is to die honorably. And he just sets it up so that, because he needs Wedge to die, so what he's been doing isn't exposed. And it's pretty masterful.
If Wedge wasn't Wedge, it would have worked.
It would have worked if it wasn't for that meddling Hallis, a secret voice recorder. But then he never finds out that he's on tape saying that again. But it's going to come up as soon as they get back to the New Republic and his trial happens.
Meg, what's your favorite? I mean, he's a despicable trash fire, but what's your favorite Tomer Darpin piece?
I just love how the way Allston initially sets him up, that we have Jansen recognizing him. Jansen telling the story of, we used to call him Ejector Darpin, and telling that story, but then also saying, we always thought he had something running on the side. So you think at first it's being set up like, this is just going to be some sort of guy and he's not good at his job. But then by just having that thing of like, he's smuggling on the side, especially when I read it the second time, I started to be, I should be paying attention here, that this man has layers, that he will have schemes going on that they are not aware of, and he clearly does not have the same morals as the pilots. I think it's just the way that he develops from seeming like a jokey character to an absolute trash fire villain.
Yeah, I like the fact that he is scarily competent, and he makes a serious argument, but I love the fact that his argument is that the New Republic is the good guys. Leia Organa Solo's ethics and morals guide the New Republic, and so it doesn't matter if I, a mid-level diplomat / intelligence chief, can bend the rules and do a bunch of murder, do a bunch of betrayal, but as long as we follow, it's very ends justify the means. And I love that Allston puts that seemingly very reasonable argument in his mouth, and then shows that Wedge rejects it outright. We have to do the right thing, or we're not the good guys.
Yeah.
Let's see. That gets us through all the main characters. Let's go through any minor characters that you'd like to highlight before we move on to the retcon and rant section of the stream.
Well, I wasn't sure how deep we'd go for the main characters, so I had a couple favorite moments for Cheris and Hallis.
Yep, go for it.
So for Hallis, there's a bit where she's talking about how the rogues or Red Flight have gone through the gauntlet. They've met back up, and Hallis and Cheris are both there. And Hallis is talking about how there were two guys who were in the rogues' quarters packing all their stuff up and talking about what they were going to steal. And as Wedge points out, Hallis is just supposed to observe and record everything. But she tells him, I followed them until they split up, and then I beat them with a Hydra spanner until they were unconscious. And Wedge is like, you're supposed to just be making the documentary. She's like, well, I got mad. And for Cheris, not to go too much into this, but I always wanted to be a pilot, and then found out medically can't get a pilot's license like ever. So the fact that she just gets her condition fixed and goes through that was something that meant a lot more on the rereads when I was even just a few years older than the first time.
Yeah, for me, Hallis, I love when we first meet her and she's got the droid head and she says, well, because research showed that children feel more comfortable around droids. And they're just like, but you got you got two heads. And then the way in which when she stops using the droid head and starts more incognito and they don't even recognize her. She's like, hi guys. And they're like, Hallis? I love her. I love her a lot. And Cheris, she's just so young. She feels very real to me as a teenager who has tried so hard to accomplish a goal. And then I think too, like Ray said, that learning that something that she thought would hold her back forever is fixed with medication, and that her life doesn't have to be dictated by this is in the way that moves me too as the reader.
And don't know how much we'll want to talk about it, but an article for like role-playing game stuff later said she became an A-Wing pilot, which as an A-Wing fan, I approve.
Yeah.
A-Wings are the best fighter. I wish there was an A-Wing series, even though I do love an X-Wing. I would say some characters I'd like to highlight. Of course, I love the line where they say, Hollis, it would help if you didn't look like a nightmare to frighten children. She takes off her head. I think a major deep theme that Allston layers in with almost all of the characters is being underestimated. So Tomer, of course, starts with that joke story, and then you slowly realize he's actually very Machiavellian, competent in his perfidy. And then Hollis, of course, just seems like this kind of shady but very silly journalist, and she turns out to be actually very ethical and moral and passionate. And Wedge is this guy who is in the dark and blundering around and seeming to make the most diplomatic faux pas possible. And he manages to basically unite an entire planet and defend it from one of the biggest military powers in the galaxy. So everything is underestimation to surprising. And I love that repeated element throughout the book. I also really like characters like Liat Ki Matino, who is the first pilot to fly against the rogues in a simulated duel. So he's the first Carton pilot who's willing to break tradition and not kill people and be willing to simulate. And then, this gets me really emotional, when Wedge is about to get killed because there's just too many people and he can't fight on. He's just vaped like 20 people by himself, and each of his friends, each of the other rogues has vaped like 12 to 15 people each. But then 20 more come, and then Liat Ki Matino turns on the other Cartonese and says, there is always time to punish incompetence. And then you find out he died defending Wedge, and you're just like, oh, it hurts because it's so beautiful. So, Liat Ki Matino, I will always remember you. And I also really love Ballas, the pilot who, spoiler, is revealed is actually the son of the Parator, the ruler of Catan. And he is Wedge's biggest fan. And he can't beg Wedge to be his friend and tell him all he knows. Just so many really, I mean, these are very small parts, like 2 to 3 scenes each, but they stick in your heart because they're so well set up and drawn. And Allston just knows how to perfectly cast that emotional turn that makes it stick. So just, I love this book from top to bottom, from front to back. And It is great, which is why the next section is going to be both hilarious and frustrating. So even though we have said, and I think this is true, that Starfighters of Adumar hasn't had a huge impact on the rest of the expanded universe, there's a bunch of people who seem to feel that you need to retcon the book itself. So in the late 2000s, you had a comic series called Star Wars Empire, and the second arc was called Darklighter, in which Hobby Clivian plays a big part. And in this book, Hobby is revealed to basically have 2 major limbs replaced by prosthetics. And in Starfighters of Adumar, Hobby says that he crashes more than the other rogues, and so he has been approached by Bacta sponsors to sponsor their medicine product.
Yeah.
If it were the case that he had prosthetics, it would make a lot more sense for him to be approached by prosthetics manufacturers.
Yes.
So it really irritates me that they felt the need to retcon Hobby as the character with lots of prosthetics. Add to that I just don't like the way they wrote the TIE fighter pilots as basically having autopilot always on.
No.
It does have good art, and there are some good things about Darklighter, but I am very salty about the way it specifically retcons Hobby in ways that do not make sense with his later characterization.
Yeah.
Have either of you read Darklighter and had similar feelings?
I have not read it. No, the comics are one area where I have read very little, but that would upset me too.
Wraith, have you read Darklighter? I don't know if we've talked about that. Oh, he's muted. He must have. Let's see. He'll be back. So I will continue with my next rant, which is the comic Lucky, which is a comic about how Wedge had a girlfriend and the Empire murdered her, and that's why he joined the Rebel Alliance. To which I say, this is nonsense. Anyone who has read Starfighters of Adumar knows that Wedge did not have lots of love affairs in his teen years.
No.
So, and it's in the very first chapter of the book. Why would you do this? Have you had the misfortune to read Lucky, Meg?
I have not had the misfortune to read that one either. It's very obvious to me that Wedge is someone who, when approaching women romantically, is like awkward and unsure of himself. So I don't know why you would make that his backstory.
And his childhood has enough tragedy in it.
Yeah, like he lost his parents.
And that's a big part of this book that we haven't brought up, is him talking about that specifically to Cheris.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wraith, do you feel similarly to me that Lucky is an unnecessary addition of a very cliched love affair to Wedge's childhood, or do you think it's not that big a deal? We talked about it a little bit in our second episode of the podcast.
I tend to ignore it.
An interesting piece, and this one I'm not actually super mad about, but it is interesting. In the very first version of the Essential Chronology by Kevin J. Anderson, Joe is trying to defend this. You cannot defend it, Joe. It is terrible and should never have been done. In the very first Essential Chronology by Kevin J. Anderson, I think Dan Wallace also contributed.
Yeah.
They included Adumar, which was nice because they didn't have to. They could have just gone with main characters. Luke, Han, and Leia. Wedge didn't have to be it, but they put a whole paragraph in, and they interestingly said that the reason Kraken pressured Wedge into fighting for Adumar is because geographically in the galaxy, it was part of the campaign to take back some of those edge territories for the Empire, and they wanted to have Adumar as a place where they could continue staging and move out from there. And I don't think that is bad, but I do think it's unnecessary. I feel like the motivation given by Kraken and Wedge is enough for it to work.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make me mad. It just made me kind of, huh.
Yeah, I think the motivation of this place could produce a lot of proton torpedoes. Don't you want proton torpedoes?
They blow up Death Stars.
and Wedge going, yeah, that is pretty important. I would think that you don't need further justification for bringing them into the New Republic, but that wouldn't hurt, I guess.
No, it is not at all on the level of our final retcon, which is The Essential Guide to Warfare, which has a justly famous and beautiful illustration by artist Darren Tan of the Lusankya fighting against Grand Admiral Pelian's Reaper Super Star Destroyer. So it's 2 Super Star Destroyers and an Endurance class carrier being obliterated between them. And this is taken from one line in the Black Fleet Crisis where the Endurance is said to have been destroyed because the commander didn't launch all his fighters.
Yes.
And so there are 5 layers of retcons, each one of them more infuriating than the last. So the first one is the commander is not a he. It is Admiral Arita Bell from Xwing Ice Heart's Revenge, who is noted to be a daredevil and not overly cautious in that book. And so the idea that she is the overly cautious commander of the Endurance is ridiculous. And also really frustrating that they kill such an awesome character in a stupid way. Now, Wraith has a little bit of perspective on this. He thinks you can make it work, and I would argue if you had to make it work, his solution makes sense. But I feel that you shouldn't have to make it work.
Part of the complication to that is it's also added that Rogris was commanding the other Super Star Destroyer along with Pelian at the battle, and so they would have gone head-to-head like a year before Adumar. But they don't talk about it.
So this gets into probably my biggest rant about the Essential Guide to Warfare. So I'm upset about Admiral Bell being substituted for a dude because she would not make that mistake. She was way cooler than that.
Yeah.
But the second thing is Wedge loses a major battle. He loses a friend. He's friends with Admiral Bell from way back in Hoth. Like they're longtime friends and acquaintances.
They're both Corellian.
Yes.
Yeah. He loses a major battle. He has to retreat with serious damage to the Lusankya. He loses a battle to Rogris in a surprise jump from 2 Super Star Destroyers. Wedge is the kind of person who would take that kind of defeat very hard because he cares about every one of his pilots. That's one of the biggest things about both Rogue Squadron and Wraith Squadron. Both series show him grappling with the deaths of his pilots, and he takes it so seriously. Mm-hmm. He would still be mourning the loss of an entire wing of pilots in this battle. At the beginning of this book, Wedge is sad because he's stuck on a desk on a Super Star Destroyer. He's not able to fly, and he's breaking up with his girlfriend. If Wedge had just lost in the last 5 to 8 months a battle in which an entire wing of his fighters were wiped out in front of him and he had to retreat, number one, he would be way sadder. He would be incredibly depressed. Number two, he would research the heck out of the people who beat him so it wouldn't happen again, so he wouldn't lose people again. So he wouldn't have to go up to the Star Destroyer and say, who's Admiral Rogris? I haven't thought about him since 6 years ago in Solo Command. No, he would know who Rogris was. Now, I think, Wraith, what was your solution to that one again?
So what I had is the Endurance was being fired at, but what really destroyed it was, since it's brand new, they had a malfunction in kind of like internal fire suppression, and fire within the ship got into their ammunition storage. And that's what blew it up. But because it was an internal design flaw that would be embarrassing to have exposed, everyone's favorite Bothan politician, covered it up and insisted, no, it's going to be, the story is that these 2 Super Star Destroyers wiped it out.
Chaos for
Mercilessly.
Rendili Drive Yards.
Oh,
And then I
thought you had a solution to the Rogris thing, though.
so this is all under the auspices of the story I'd written, that since Wedge had brought that up, this was how I quasi-retconned back Essential Guide to Warfare. So I had that Wedge's question to Saladan about what do you think of Rogris is his way of trying to get at, do you know the story Borst is putting out in secret or not? And as far as Rogris, so I had his point of view in Arinda 2. And he's thinking, the Endurance was a brave stand to try and get things in line against 2 of our Super Star Destroyers. That's the caliber of officers they have over there, and we're not going to win, even if we've defeated one of them. So we won today, but we're going to lose the war, type thinking. So that's why he's not going to bring it up either.
So I think that is a noble and admirable effort, and if you are trying to work with the entirety of everything published, that's what you'd have to do. I do not. I reject the Essential Guide to Warfare section on Arinda completely. It is not true.
Well, for reasons I won't go into here, Arated Bell's death was also part of the plot. But I've talked enough about my thing.
Well, I mean, I did bring it up. I want people to know that if they want to find Dorset Kinnair stories, there is a very excellent one that you can find. I have had the chance to meet with Jason Fry, and I chose not to take it because I would get too mad about this. At some point, maybe I will figure out a way to approach him diplomatically and not be a jerk, because that's my big thing. Is I hate it when you hear stories about fans just yelling at creators because they're really mad. Not to say I don't think you can. Obviously, I'm very upset about what Jason Fry wrote, but what good does it do if I go up to him and vent on him? He just comes away thinking that I'm kind of a jerk. He's not going to change what he thinks. So I do not advocate people going up to authors and being jerks because you're upset. I do advocate making podcasts where you can express your frustration. It just frustrates me that I feel like because Essential Guide to Warfare was one of the last books published as part of the expanded universe, and because it was so beautifully put together on the art level, like Darren Tan and Ansel So and so many of the other artists who contributed to that book did such a great job that people bought it to look at the great pictures of these ships and battles that are very worthwhile. That I think it has an undue influence on how people see Wedge and Rogris and Arita Bell and the Battle of Arinda. I think people remember it better because it was one of the last things out there and has great art. Whereas I wish people would remember Rogris and Wedge and Bell from the Xwing books.
Yeah.
And so that's my big frustration with the Essential Guide to Warfare. Now, I wanted to wrap up our stream with a little game of bringing obscure Starfighters of Adumar quotes and try to see if we can stump the other. Now, I feel like we're probably all going to be able to recognize most of them, but let's try our best. So, Meg, do you have an obscure quote you want to try and stump us with?
Oh, I have one where it's, oh gosh, I gotta find it.
Okay,
I gotta find it.
Let's go with Wraith then, because I know Wraith has a list.
Okay. Yes.
Hopefully, Wraith's first one isn't Meg's.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's some crossover between our lists. So mine is, and a bonus if you can guess the context. Yes, yes, yes.
So is that when Cheris finds out Yell is not a pilot?
No.
No, because that's no.
Oh, it's Hobby, I think.
Oh, when he wants to shoot things?
No.
No. Okay.
Okay, we've both failed. What is it?
Yeah.
It's Wes when Wedge tells them that they don't have to wear the dress uniform at first.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Meg, have you been successful?
Yes. Well, I found one of mine. I do love this one. I feel like it's sort of obvious, but I just love the whole quote. Oh, that'd be good. You and Hobby running through the streets of Cartan, leaving destruction in your wake, taking charge when a delicate political disaster strikes. Here's an example. A noble of Cartan comes to you and says, I know we have no diplomatic relations yet, but I'm here to request asylum in the New Republic. What do you say? And then the other character responds, is she good looking?
Thanks for proving my point, Wes.
Yep.
That's obviously the Wedge why he doesn't leave Wes in charge speech.
Yes, because he would cause a diplomatic emergency.
So my first one is Joe. I don't think Jason Fry knows I exist. Admiral Byzantium also got the reference. My first one is restraining myself so you could keep up with me left me plenty of time for intellectual pursuits. I also composed a symphony and drafted a plan to bring peace to the galaxy.
I had that written down as my backup character moment of somebody else.
No, so he knows what it is.
So yes, it is what Tycho was doing while they were familiarizing themselves with the Blade 32.
Yes.
Yeah, it was Tycho.
Which I love because if you read that iJedi scene, you know that Tycho is just on another intellectual level from most pilots.
Yeah.
All right, Wraith, do you have another one for us?
Until now, I thought this was a really sweet deal.
Oh man, I want to say that's
It's one of the pilots. Oh.
Yeah, I feel like it's either Hobby or Wes, and I'm trying to remember which one. I think it's Hobby, but I don't actually remember the context.
Yes, it's when they first run into the other 4 Imperial pilots.
Oh yeah, that's right, at that banquet. And things get real. Meg, do you have another one?
Yeah. So probably no one knows their name, but this is she of the glorious hair. Are you here from rage? He touched his fingers, still wrapped around the pistol butt, to his heart. Or from love? He touched them to his lips.
It's the guy that was going to duel Ayala's neighbor.
Yes.
Oh man, I was going to get it wrong. I was going to say Ayala's neighbor, but that's right. It's not his neighbor.
It's the guy. Yeah, it is Aerosol K. Volton. He's like,
hey,
you are not here
I'm proud
for
that I
me.
remember Liat Kimatino.
Yeah. I love him. I love how he leaves them and says frothing disease to your foes then. And then they hear him like murder the neighbor.
And Ayala's starting to say what's going on. It's my neighbor so and so. And Wedge is like in a feud with this other guy.
Yeah.
You know him? You meet a lot of people when you're an ambassador. Because
Yeah.
he doesn't want to admit that he's been skulking around for who knows how long.
All right, so here's my next one. Sort of like being shot until you're unconscious, except there's no Bacta, and you often end up feeling better than when you started.
I think that's Hobby.
That is correct.
But I don't remember when, but that just sounds like Hobby.
It is Hobby when... so actually, I got this wrong when I was looking for it. I thought it was before the major battle for Cartan, but it was actually Hobby to Wedge just before everything goes wrong, when Wedge isn't sleeping because he's trying to figure out the way out of the problem. And Hobby's like, have you ever thought about sleep? And Wedge is like, what's sleep? And then he says that quote. All right, Wraith, do you have a final quote to try and stump us? I feel like you have the best stumping so far.
Stop acting like a kid. You're embarrassing me.
That is Wes when Wedge is walking on the curb after he's finally made
Yes.
out with Yella. What is that? It's the sun. Go shoot it out. It's like 1,000,000 miles away. Well, get in your Xwing and shoot it.
Poor Wes.
And Meg, do you have a final one for us?
Yes. So this is, if you haven't already chosen something suicidal, I have a mission for you. And the person responds, did that already.
Yes, I know what it is, but I'll give Wedge a chance to guess.
Well, the first one is Wedge to Ayala,
Yeah.
which perhaps should have been my favorite piece of Ayala because he's just so competent.
Yeah.
And
I love how he's like, I want you to do these things. And she's like, oh, I already did it.
and it is going up to the Allegiance, their Star Destroyer, to try and pass on the message of what's happening.
Yeah. He
And she
says,
does even better by leaving a file mislabeled as my will, which contains the entire plan. And so my final quote is, the diligent one. That may not sound too romantic, but diligent has a couple of colloquial meanings that add to your luster.
oh, that's Wes.
Yes.
That's because was it Wedge was the diligent one, and he's like, "What?" And Wes is like, "No, it's good."
And of
But then
course,
later someone
Wes,
says, oh, that's the diligent one.
yeah, Wes says he's the darling one.
Yes, but
Is he really?
is he really?
I mean, I feel like he is because he wears all their clothes, and they love that.
Yeah.
And I guess that Joe is secretly Adumari at heart because he loves Wes too. And then Biz has a great quote. Why don't Wes and I smuggle ourselves over to Agonizer and destroy her with thrown rocks? With the right tools, say 100,000 Ewoks in a month to prepare, you could probably do that. Which is pretty funny because Allston has been pretty open about not liking the Ewoks. So I think it's funny that he keeps wiggling that sore tooth.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that brings us pretty much to a good conclusion for our celebration of Starfighters of Adumar. It's been 25 years since this came out, and at least 24 since most of us have read it. I guess Wraith probably has been about 22-ish, maybe 20.
Yeah, at least 20.
But I look forward to sharing this with my nieces and nephews. My oldest nephew is 10, but he's not a big reader yet, so I've got to wait a bit. And my next nephew is 7, so I think it's at least 3 years before I can start him on that, but I will when I can.
I personally can't wait for an unabridged audiobook recording
Oh, yes.
of Starfighters of Adumar. I know they're going to get to it because they're in the Wraith Squadron books right now, mainly because the abridged audiobook just cuts off so many of the jokes.
Yes. Biz says, you're making me feel old, and I'm like, I'm older than you, Biz. Now imagine how bad the abridged version of Vision of the Future is. They literally cut out 90% of Luke and Mara's plotline, and I'm just like, why?
Oh no.
Meg, because I know Wedge is listening to this. If you haven't heard the new audiobook with the Kwam Kwe voices, they are hysterical.
Oh, yeah. I've listened to the unabridged Thrawn trilogy, but I haven't listened to the Hand of Thrawn duology, and I need to.
It's very worth it.
So good. Just the voice work. And
Mark Thompson, we love you. All right, so that wraps us up. Thank you so much for joining us, Meg, and thanks to my regular co-host, Wraith. I couldn't do this without you. I mean, I could, but it'd be pretty boring to just watch me sort of noodle about how much I love obscure 90s Star Wars books. But doing it with two people who know as much or more about it than me is fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for the audience who joined us and anyone who watches us in the future.